I've never been so excited to cover such a large number of episodes since my top 10 best Teen Titans Go episodes video. Infinity Train has had a spectacular season, and I hope I do it justice. For time reasons, I won't really cover any episode too in depth, but I'm always up for highlighting a particular episode that many people really enjoy in its own separate review. So let's get into it. Also plug in my Discord. Episode 1, The Grid Car. Tulip, a headstrong 13-year-old girl, finds a mysterious train where every car contains its own universe. As I said in a review I did for it, I enjoyed this episode and everything that it stood to do. I love how it sets a tone for everything that goes on within it. It has a solid grasp on dialogue, not making it sound too hokey or too much, and keeps the action going quickly without glossing over anything that isn't important. The music composition within this episode is top notch. My favorite character in this episode is obviously Tulip, as her struggles with coping with the divorce alongside her confusion with being on this train provided for an excellent performance. I love how her character isn't always happy, and that she has other emotions other than optimism and sadness. She also comes across very naive, which gives her room to improve and grow alongside the audience. The monsters' designs were really cool as well, and I thought the episode having a large number focus was a great concept.
Alright, good guy, pop that bad guy! Bad guy's turn!
In hindsight, I guess the only part of the episode that was just okay was the car. So this episode focuses on this grid car that can create anything using cube shapes that give off a musical note when touched. Although this would come into play both in the exploration stage and the conflict between Tulip and the monster, as we've learned throughout Minecraft or Roblox, generally these concepts are what you make of it. Maybe it's because everything else in this episode is really good that this is probably great, but in comparison to everything else, it's lacking that magic that made everything else work so well. But I didn't find the car itself to be that interesting. Overall, it's a great episode, and a fantastic introduction into Tulip, 1-1, and the train.
I've got vision, my good man, and that vision needs a team. Well, I've never been part of a team. Oh, it sounds easy and profitable. When I started Team Randall 38 minutes ago, the mission statement was always be there for each other.
It's more complicated than that.
Episode 2, The Beach Car. Tulip strikes a deal with the cat in an attempt to get home, but is the price worth it? So this episode does a few things differently to push the characters, the lore, and the show forward. Firstly, the episode doesn't start off in the car that it will be spending majority of the time in the episode, and while the car they settled on worked really well, and so far is my favorite between episodes 1 and 2, I did enjoy that robotic crossword solver sort of car. I really wish that came into play, but maybe it will someday. This episode has less to do with exploring and getting your feet wet when it comes to adjusting to what Infinity Train is about, and shows more of the dynamic between 1-1 and Tulip, while also introducing a new character. Now this new cat character, who doesn't appear to be named or is called the cat, is a very interesting variation of the Khan character. While it's clear to the audience that her actions are not coming from the best intentions, she doesn't play up her Khan identity in a cartoonishly wacky way. There isn't a scene where she turns away from the character and gives a long, wacky sort of monologue on how she plans to con the main character out of something. She's a Khan character who does her best to appear pure. In fact, she does a few things that I want to highlight. Firstly, she plays to these water people's interests, giving them things that seem interesting to them, even if they have no true value. She does this to get sales, even though she's not into money. She loves to have items that seem valuable for other reasons, which leads me to believe that while 1-1 may not outwardly show any significance, other than being a character who has been on this train longer than Tulip, he may hold the key to information that is valuable, or he himself may be valuable to get somewhere. Maybe his mother plays a factor in this. Speaking of 1-1 and a cat, she shows here,
if I put this donut hat on my head, will I die?
Sure, why not?
Charming fellow, but not the most reliable, is he?
that she applies logic and reason to throw Tulip off her game, as Tulip is a very rational person. However, despite how skeptical and rational Tulip is, she's still a kid on the train by herself. She's still scared and naive and will bend to emotion in certain situations, even if it means sacrifice. So we see how she really feels about 1-1 in this episode. I think it shows that they really do care about each other, even if 1-1 gets in the way sometimes. This episode really ramps up the fact that he doesn't help that much, even though in the episode before this, 1-1 literally saved Tulip's life. This episode, The Beach Car, also shows us how 1-1 reacts to sadness and disappointment, both in the handoff of a flower that 1-1 specifically gave to Tulip to one of the water people for a part for Cat's flying machine, and in the handoff of 1-1 himself, he gives a very cold but understanding reaction to these events, which shows that he has some level of awareness. It's also realistic for Tulip to not have so much of a deep commitment to 1-1, considering that they just met. Speaking of Tulip though, we learned that her name comes from the fact that she may have barely made it out alive and bounced back like a tulip. So now divorce, death, and discussion about nearly being a stillborn. And what's crazy is there's surprisingly little violence so far. I love the cat, and I really want to see where they go from here.
You just made a big mistake. Good luck getting off this train now.
Have I got a deal for you? Say there, you look like a smart gal. This donut.
My favorite character surprisingly isn't the cat. She'd be the third in this episode, under 1-1's performance and the water people. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the cat, but I find the water people, specifically Randall, to be fascinating. I love his attitude towards everything, and how he's one of many who see things in terms of their emotional value towards a person, rather than a number of cash assigned to an item. Overall, it's a fun episode, and it gives 1-1 a great spotlight to dive deep into his split personality. Oh, and before I move on, I want to say that despite the show handling the decreasing number on Tulip's hand a little weird in the beginning, as I thought it would be built up to a little bit better, or at least to be a bigger deal, they cleverly switched the number from the beginning to the end of the episode. They don't make a big deal out of it, and it's clear that they wanted you to rewind and verify that this isn't the same number that you saw in the beginning of the episode.
Didn't you want to go outside?
Yes.
Outside?
No.
Outside?
Well,
Outside?
maybe.
Come on.
Well,
Wanna go outside right now?
No.
You wanna do it? You wanna go outside?
Yes, I want to go outside.
Episode 3, the Corgi Car. Tulip and 1-1 explore a car full of corgis and face off against a mysterious monster. Now, this is another episode that I kind of covered before it came out. Kind of. This is because this episode is somewhat built off the short that I covered a while back, when I was very hyped about Infinity Train, so I may gloss over what they didn't change to talk about what they did change. I noticed that these episodes are built in a way that with each episode they cover something new about the train, but also a way for Tulip to learn and grow. Whereas in the last episode it was about Tulip's relationship with 1-1, and her learning that this train isn't 100% filled with people who have her best intentions at heart, this episode, the Corgi Car, it focuses on patience, a quality that Tulip hasn't mastered yet. There's a lot of rushing in a story sense, not in a production/workflow sense, where Tulip runs through cars to get answers quickly. This makes sense for a character as she's young. It makes sense for her to want to get off the car immediately, regardless of how reckless she may be trying to do it. 1-1 is also very supportive, which makes his character needed alongside this journey. So we get to Corginia, an ancient Greek-inspired land full of corgis who follow a strict but playful structure that allows for a king. We'll be focusing on the king, King Atticus, and his struggles to keep Corginia safe from rising waters caused by a mysterious monster. Although this episode doesn't focus much on the car, I noticed that like the other episode, the beach car, they do dedicate at least some time to exploring the land before going forward in their journey. We get to see this mysterious robot figure, who may have some answers as to what's going on, as when she faces it, 1, she's clearly outpowered in this encounter, but more importantly 2, her number on her hand goes down, which may be a correlation. Unlike the pilot, we get to see more of Atticus and his loyalty towards his people and Tulip. The funniest joke in this episode is still retained and is still funny. We actually get some action within this episode, even if it was shown in a short. They replaced the pipe that Atticus shuts off for these orbs that appear to bend reality, which is an interesting change. My favorite character obviously in this is Atticus. His voice, his tendencies, and his positive attitude towards everything make him such a lovable character. Overall, although I've seen quite a bit of what goes on here, I still think this is a good episode, which gives us a new antagonist to watch out for.
Sorry, buddy. Sometimes you just gotta go logical. Oh no. No, 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 no! It's locked!
Episode 4, the Crystal Car. Tulip, Atticus, and 1-1 enter a crystal forest car and have to take part in a musical ritual. So this is an episode that doesn't outright have an antagonist that they fight against, whereas in the first episode there was this black cockroachy age-defying monster sort of deal, the second episode had the cat, and the third episode had the steward. This is an episode that deals with Tulip's patience, like in the last episode. It actually gets to the crystal car quite early, being shown after a very brief trip in an Italian-themed car. They make it clear clear that Tulip is going to bump her head a little bit in this car, before figuring a way out. She learns that brute forcing is not the way to go, in attempts such as building a ladder to get to an incredibly high door. I'm drawing a lot of mental parallels between this episode and a few episodes of Mao Mao, Heroes of Pure Heart, considering that some people may realize that a lot of episodes deal with Tulip being impatient, in a way that there's a lot of episodes that deal with the Doorbat being naive. Do I have a problem here like I do there? No. Within those episodes, I find Adorabat's actions to be what holds the show back, because it's not as entertaining as the other antics that go on within those episodes, like in No Shortcuts. Here, I don't see Tulip as holding the show back, because she isn't just doing the impatient game. She's very cynical, highly critical of herself alongside being skeptical, and giving in to when something is cute or fun. Now yes, Adorabat shares some of these traits, but the ratio of venturing outside her primary personality trait is different there and here. But getting back to this episode, to explain that, you'd have to see how Tulip gets increasingly frustrated throughout this episode. Everyone around her is telling her to stop and reflect, rather than going forward and trying the next thing until she forces her way into the next car. She barely understands why the number goes down in some cars but not others, and she doesn't really know that much about the train overall. Atticus also brings some of the less gimmicky dialogue that 1-1 may be too limited in giving, for now, which is a plus.
Oh, do we have to sing?
I also enjoy this Crystal character. Although not speaking much, I like how I'm able to understand him just fine, although it did take a second. And also, they also did, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not kidding, not joking at all, completely serious, not a joke, not edited at all. They also did a cover of Word Up from Cameo. I have no words. No, even though I'm saying a lot of good things about the episode, it's not as exciting as its counterparts. Maybe it's because it's missing a great struggle that it feels like a side quest, even though it's a part of the main conflict. By design, it feels less entertaining and invigorating than the first 3 episodes, and one of those was an extension of the story of the pilot. They try in some areas, such as having Atticus take the front wheel in some scenes, barking at a squirrel, telling a long story, but it doesn't do it for me. Heck, even the large crystal key holder just seems alright. Nothing too interesting with his design. He doesn't speak either, so there's nothing memorable that I can quote. The most interesting thing about him is that his giant fingers block how a key like that opens a door like this. Take out the karaoke from Tulip alongside the semi-cool looking car, and you have a boring episode. My favorite character in this is still Tulip regardless. Even though she didn't have that much competition in the form of other people doing anything significant or entertaining, I do praise her internal struggle throughout the episode. It made me root for her to have a better understanding of herself. Also, I just found her being very embarrassed to sing when the song was connected to a memory that made her feel very vulnerable, very wholesome. But overall, I just consider this an okay episode. Nothing too special.
What was that?
Episode 5, The Cat Car. Tulip has to face her past. So this episode is very similar to an episode of Final Space that I found to be a very amazing episode. In fact, it's my favorite episode of season 1. In that episode, we had Gary relive his past with his father, and looking at old memories that he wished he could alter but unfortunately can't. This has a lot of time manipulation going on from the cat. It's very interesting that of the 2 antagonists on the train, the cat and the steward, Tulip treats the cat very casually. Tulip, being a very skeptical and cynical person, has a sub-layer of trust for the cat, which may be attributed to her naivety. However, it's clear that her malice didn't stop in the beach car. Let's center in on this cat character. It's clear that she's both a hoarder for different objects, and I'd love to know why. Seeing that she's clearly both outnumbered and outmatched if things were to go physical, she aims to exploit emotion and the ignorance of people's knowledge of what goes on this train. Speaking of, the train cars move in a really cool scene.
So cars on the train can just move around?
The cat is later learned to work alongside the steward, but under a much more hidden foe. It's a super engaging part. It makes you want to see how this all plays out, because it shows that the cat is really against Tulip's side out of fear. I love all of it. My only question is, why send the cat? It's clear that based off of the Corgi Car, that the steward is much more of an effective and powerful foe. that it could easily retrieve Tulip. Maybe the cat made a deal to be the middleman for the steward? I guess we don't know. However, that is only what happens at the beginning and end of the episode. There's this middle part which I'd be a fool to overlook. This episode takes a large look at Tulip's past, her accuracy of what she remembers, and how she felt about the big announcement that her parents gave her. She gets here because of a tape that the cat just so happened to have lying around, intentionally trying to get it in front of Tulip in the efforts to get her lost in her own thoughts. It's a very powerful amount of scenes, because we see that Tulip has been slowly masking a lot of memories, and not seeing them for what they were. It's clear that her mom and dad argue a lot, and while she may not want to see it for the reality it is, it's clear that these true depictions affect her severely. It's also a nice touch to have Tulip not notice this immediately, because at first, she does think that these are the way that things truly went down. My favorite scene though, has to be her reacting to when her parents announce a divorce.
Are you okay?
Yeah, why wouldn't I be? You're not. Are you getting divorced?
Well, right now we're just separating.
But then you're gonna get divorced after that. It's not that simple.
It's not that simple, bud.
Yeah, it is. You're either married or you're not.
The way her parents are not on the same wavelength, stepping over each other to let Tulip know that they still love her, the way that Tulip is very cold and shut away from the situation to protect herself emotionally, the tiny detail of her playing with something and ripping it with her hands, which again, very relatable. The way present day Tulip is very aware that she feels one way, but is not expressing that to her parents. All of this was so powerful to me, and just felt perfect. I didn't expect an episode like this that had these type of emotions to happen in episode 5, but I'm appreciative of it. I feel like my favorite character has to be Tulip. They play it up really well. The cat's car is also interesting, and maybe I just have to speak more with the fandom, but it may be underrated. Even though we don't get much in terms of what goes on around it, as I spent a lot of this episode within the confines of a memory tape, I love the look of it and how it matches the cat's personality. It's a fantastic episode and worthy of its own separate review video.
I am Aloysius III, Emperor and Unifier of the hard and soft-shelled.
Tacos?
Turtles.
Come now, Tulip.
Episode 6, The Unfinished Car. The gang enters an unfinished train car and tries to fix it. So this is a very weird episode. We essentially enter a train car that has a society built on a very broken and possibly unstable infrastructure. The train also causes 1-1 to act very irrationally, wanting to fix everything that goes on around him. And it's very fitting that this episode comes after the previous one, and I'll explain why. Again, this episode doesn't deal with any huge monster, which at this point, it has shifted what I should expect from Infinity Train. More so dealing with the inner conflict at points, rather than towering monsters in each car. Fortunately, the cars have been so interesting that the conflict, struggle, and antagonists have really held their own. The most fascinating aspect of this episode, I suppose, is how the Turtle Society acts. I'm sure I'm in a minority, as the elephant in the room is 1-1, but hear me out here. These turtle folk seem to be optimistic. And I know I use this word in a negative sense many times when discussing characters in animation, but this is a different type of optimism. They aren't bombastic and outgoing with their optimism. They seem to be pretty self-aware about their situation, and have made the best with what is given to them. Yes, it isn't perfect, but it doesn't need to be. The turtle folk have made genuinely happy lives out of the tiny mistakes that have been littered throughout this car. And even if 1-1 who irrationally misunderstands the fact that these people don't know this, all these little mistakes, Tulip does, because she was just in the cat's car. She understands that situations aren't perfect, and they won't be fixed, and you can't just be better in retrospect, because what's done is done. Sometimes fixing a situation can just break it more. This provides us insight as to how 1-1 feels about the situation, because we haven't seen much of that. Yes, he is looking for his mom, but that doesn't really give us much. These scenes have only happened in short occasional segments, and hasn't been directly tackled until now. This episode also plays around with the concept of gravity, and I enjoy that a lot. Atticus was also a very nice and possibly overlooked role.
We need to get... Hey, no, don't do that.
Why? I just want to know what you're thinking.
No, stop it. Fine.
His regal attitude fit perfectly here. It's pretty clear that this climax really shaped 1-1's attitude. However, we are not sure if this is really his attitude. You see, both in and out of the car, he had this effect that changes the color of his eyes. It's clear that something affects the way that he deals with things, at least within this car, so I'm not sure if his feelings were genuine or tinkered with. Either way, if I could describe this episode in one word, it'd be fascinating. Even though I think this is a good episode, maybe not great, because it doesn't do much that knocks it out of the park, the one execution that I think did knock it out of the park was the car. So far, this is my favorite car in concept. I love everything about it, and story-wise, it served as the perfect parallel for Tulip and 1-1 to have a deep conversation. Overall, it was very good, and 1-1 was my favorite character. Episode 7, The Corgi Car. The gang meets a familiar face in a mirrored car. Now it's been 3 episodes where the foe that Tulip had to face was rooted within an internal conflict. The crystal car dealt with Tulip's embarrassment and rush to get out of the car. The cat car dealt with Tulip's feelings towards a divorce. The last episode, the unfinished car, dealt with 1-1's feelings towards trying to be better. So this episode, while so deep in internal conflicts, has an external conflict. I would compare this car to be similar to the crystal car, as even though the concept has a lot of different things that you can do within the car, it's only really used to get one point off really well. And that point is reflected Tulip, or our Tulip from this point on. We learned that our Tulip's job is to mirror all of Tulip's actions, essentially not being able to do anything besides that. Given her rebellious personality, her reflection is also that, not wanting to just live in someone else's reflection. By tricking Tulip, which is a very gray area sort of action because she did need a chrome person to open a door, she wants to escape but only realizes that she can't because she needs a reflected surface in order to travel. This leads into a pretty fantastic scene, where her reflection and her talk very in depth about her personality. It was a needed talk as Tulip seemed to be the most emotionally mature and articulate person of the trio, which isn't saying much. To have someone who can have such a critical deep dive of your personality speaks volumes to this character. I love the reflection concept that this episode explores, and as a car, while visually uninteresting, it has some of that societal magic that the last episode excelled at. I also enjoyed the Chrome Police, making their way to arrest anyone who doesn't do as their reflection does. How come they don't have reflections? Why do they need faces in order to pass on into the other world? How come they took away the other expressions? Do expressions know what their job is supposed to be, or are they born once a unique item enters the car? As you can see, I have a lot of questions. So far, I'd say my favorite episode would have to be the cat car, but this episode surpasses that in enjoyability. I like how this episode strikes a balance between deep introspective internal conflicts and exciting action-packed external conflicts to give it something that both sides can enjoy. I like to imagine those who wanted something deeper have been spoiled with the last few episodes, but those who want to see more action that the first episode provided have been waiting since the crystal car, really. My favorite character in here is our Tulip. She seems to be like Tulip except critical of herself, or Tulip, which Tulip kind of does, but not to the level that our Tulip did. Maybe this is just my bias towards these characters, look at Peridot, but the character who has lived one way and is immediately shown the world around them and is fascinated by every little thing, that's just my type of character. That level of curiosity is honestly very heartwarming. This may or may not be my favorite car, I'm not too sure yet, but it is my favorite episode so far. It's an overall fantastic episode, and I can't wait to cover the next one.
I have an artifact that needs to be returned to its sacred holding chamber. The Jiggle Wiggle.
Episode 8, The Ball Pit Car. The gang is confronted by a strange new force on a ball pit car adventure. Indeed, they did. Before we get into the strange new force, a few things have to be talked about. I love how they spend the first quarter of the episode in a very light, cheery, and fun mood. They picked one of the best cars to immediately switch moods in. This is the ball pit car, and it plays out like your typical ball pit indoor playground park. The main sort of character is this very playful and innocent being who only wishes to play with Tulip. However, it's masked as sort of an adventure that the group goes through. You may or may not notice that in the background, there's a being moving, and it caught my eye completely, causing me to rewind and verify that it was something irregular and not a shadow. I love how this first quarter plays out, but what happens after that is a work of beauty. The steward makes its way to capture Tulip, something you would have expected it to do a lot earlier. However, we get to meet the conductor.
This would have been so much easier for all of us if you had just stayed put. But instead you go through car after car interfering with my plans, attacking my steward for months, and despite all of that, I still wanted to help you.
This is the same fellow that we would have seen in the episode The Cat's Car, and it's clear that they run the train as far as we know. He's the almighty and powerful being led by a steward who has made it pretty clear that Tulip should
Turn to your seat.
She didn't, and because of the friends she made along the way, they have to suffer. It's actually a really sad pair of scenes, and as the series has built up, this is not the kind of show where someone is going to swoop in and save the day. This is not the kind of show where even if there's 30 seconds left, they will brute force a happy ending. Tulip is in a constant struggle from beginning to end, and this episode makes no exception. And there's a sad scene of this episode and this series. Atticus ends up turning into this disgusting, horrible monster that we would have seen at the end of the first episode, which makes me think that those monsters were beings that were manipulated by the conductor. There's still so much mystery that surrounds the train that we may not get any of these answers. These scenes were intense, with Tulip being powerless to the people that she's grown close to being mistreated. We also see proof that the cat doesn't really want to be this way, the type of person to do wrong and others' bidding. However, she's forced to for her own safety. They also portrayed a villain to have a purpose and a point. If it wasn't for Tulip's tampering, then they would have most likely stayed in their own cars. Maybe it was the water rising that kept the folks of Corginia at bay. Maybe it was the lack of simulation in people that would have kept 1-1 where he was at. The conductor is a great villain, and I can't wait to gush about this in detail in its own episode. It may not be my favorite car, however it's a great car, a great episode, and my favorite character is obviously the conductor.
Wait, are we leaving Atticus behind?
He's not Atticus anymore.
Episode 9, The Pass Car. Tulip takes a risk, trusting an old foe. Now, when I saw this premise, I knew it was going to be the cat. This is the only episode so far that technically does not enter a new car. They stay in the broken ball pit car, as Tulip doesn't want to leave the now transformed Atticus. She has a lot of good lines within this episode, and 1-1 surprisingly doesn't make things less impactful, and rather uses his comedic moments precisely. So, as this episode suggests, she ends up helping the cat, which you'd think she wouldn't considering that the cat did a lot to mess things up for her and was generally misleading. However, to the audience, we know that the cat just wants to be left alone, and saw Tulip as a means to get that. But they will always have a common foe, and the cat is not dumb. So it only makes reasonable sense to go after the conductor with Tulip, as Tulip can do so much more physically. It's very sad towards the beginning, as we basically get a Tulip running out of options, just being upset towards everything. It never comes across annoying though. This was a necessary episode, but I can't find myself not thinking that this just serves as the bridge between episode 8 and 10, with not much of an identity on its own. Sure, we get the conductor's past, but a part of me wants to believe that if they fuse this episode with the last, nothing really changes. It feels like the part 1 to the finale, the engine. That doesn't make it bad, just not standing on its own legs. In fact, I consider this episode to be somewhat similar to episodes like The Future and The Inquisition from The Amazing World of Gumball, where it only works if we get the payoff. And if we don't, then the show would be largely incomplete. So getting into it, they go back into those weird memory tapes, and rather than learning how to fix Atticus through possibly going through Atticus's tapes, they go through the conductor's tapes. It is here where we learn the conductor's backstory.
Hey, come on, please, open up. Look, I know it's hard, but it'll be good to go. We're all here for you.
Where's Amelia?
Gone forever?
Without getting too specific, the conductor is a woman who entered the train and made it her own. She was in a great relationship with the guy who naturally didn't take her absence too well. We don't learn exactly what makes the train appear in the first place. Maybe another season will do that, but the memory warping and 1-1's vague answers as to how he bends time is pretty confusing. And I know there's a large mystery element when it comes to Infinity Train, but there's a difference between not having that many puzzle pieces to figure out what the puzzle is and shrugging it and going, oh, I don't know. I know that's 1-1's character, but maybe we'll learn more about him in the last episode. One thing that really develops Tulip's attitude towards going home and the train is when she realizes that herself and the conductor aren't really that different. I mean, when you think about it, the conductor left Tulip in a car that just has a lot of snow. Wouldn't she be bound by curiosity to travel? It's not like she got dropped off in a train that looks like Oshkosh, and she slowly figured out that her reality wasn't really real. But more importantly, she's given what she wants right after making an internal promise to restore Atticus to his true form. Now, of course, she doesn't take it, and after wanting wanting to get off the train so much, it's an incredible shift. Honestly, my favorite character in all of this would have to go to the cat. She was in her prime form this episode. I enjoy how she took Tulip all throughout this journey to learn about the conductor for showmanship. I really turned the corner on her character. This was a good episode. Again, it served as the bridge between two other episodes.
Well, I guess goodbye, cat. Is it cat?
The cat.
Episode 10. The Engine. Tulip makes it to the front of the train and is faced with a choice. I really enjoyed this episode. It's literally what I enjoy about episodes like the Ball Pit Car, just with the added storyline mark of being the end. Kind of. Now, as many of us know, Infinity Train is supposed to go on, and it didn't end here, which leads me to think that there are more characters and stories to have. Tulip makes a firm stance to not leave the train without getting Atticus back. So after a pretty straightforward scene of the cat and Tulip parting ways after the cat decided to not go to the engine, Tulip gets into the action pretty quickly. Knowing about all the different aspects that happen to make the conductor who she is, they actually have a great back and forth, both when it comes to the action and dialogue. As a fan, I can say I was kind of underwhelmed with how the steward was used throughout the entire series, just being sort of the muscle. We never really know much about the steward, but if we are to be under the assumption that more episodes are coming out and we may see the steward some more, then it's fine. We learned that 1-1's mom was the controls of the train.
You ripped 1-1 out of the control panel.
He had all that power and he refused to make a cut for me.
And that reaffirmed my suspicions that 1-1's mom was going to be a game changer. Firstly, if 1-1 can control Tulip's number and make it go down, which by the way was a great sacrifice as Tulip once again had the opportunity to go home and chose to risk staying on the train forever just to save Atticus, but if 1-1 can control what your number is, then the conductor or former conductor showing her number doesn't really mean much. 1-1 can simply just reduce the number quickly. Now of course she was a very crappy person, pretty selfish, nearly killed Tulip on many occasions, but that doesn't mean that her number has any more significance. Secondly, it should go without saying that the action is top notch, but the fact that 1-1 isn't directly confronted seems pretty convenient and it opens up more questions. So the cat wants no part in taking down the conductor. If she's a wise woman or cat, whatever you want to call her, you would think that she'd consider that maybe it's in her best interest to at least make sure that Tulip beats the conductor, because let's just say worst case scenario, Tulip gets sent back somewhere on the train. Welp, the cat's dead. Or at least severely harmed, because it's clear that she double-crossed them. Even if you were to make the argument that the conductor didn't know about any of the scenario, she still didn't do her job. Her job was to deliver them to the conductor. It makes me think about the beach car, and how the cat was going to deliver 1-1 to the conductor. I don't get why that's such a big deal now. If the conductor was the one who took out 1-1 and pushed 1-1 back far in the train in the first place, then they had the ability to do so much more than just send 1-1 a couple of train cars back. In the grand scheme of a near infinite train, they sent 1-1 so far back that 1-1 was able to get back to the beginning of the train fairly easily. For a train that has a mechanism that can send cars back for miles quickly, that just seems kinda dumb. Almost as if at points the villain was built to be toppled over quite easily. I'm not expecting this master villain who rivals the great villains of all time, but they set up a lot of things that if backfired, sets the conductor back astronomically. And Tulip stumbled over them just to save the day. The engine was also just there. It wasn't a car that was supposed to give off a lot of visual interest because it's more about the battle and how the series so far ends, but regardless, my favorite character in this would have to be a tie between the conductor and Tulip. Both of them face an internal struggle that would conclude within this episode. Tulip would be much happier when she's home and not ready to shut herself off. My highlight here was when the conductor made a trade.
What if you could create a car, Tulip? One where your parents are still together.
But then they wouldn't be my real parents. They wouldn't be my real life. They weren't happy together.
And Tulip didn't want that, but she would have at one point. I suppose the only part I'm curious about is how much time was spent here. Does she get placed back into before she left, or does she get transported to before she left? Or is there a big missing piece in this puzzle? Either way, a phenomenal episode and a great way to end the series. Overall, this was a fantastic series. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend it, especially if you've gotten this far and you haven't watched it or haven't finished it yet. Please do. Anyway, let me know what you think about these seasonal reviews. I can't do them for everything, but if there's high demand for something, I'll try to see what I can do. Anyway, if you want to know what I thought about the first episode in its own review, click here. And if you want to know what I thought about the short, the pilot before that, click here. Special thanks to the patrons of August, and until next time. Take care. Alpha out.